Hello, folks. Following on from Peter's lecture on advanced liberalism and Derrida's lecture on the market agenda, I start this short lecture with a typical staff scenario. There are three teachers who are discussing their work, which reflects how teachers experience teaching currently. So Jack talks about how, because all that matters is next week, the testing, and the others agree with Christine, then stating how that's just it. And I think that stings. She talks about how we teach at a certain standard and we are expected to bring the students up to that standard, but we can't, because we can't get them there, because you've got to think about the testing and performance that is surrounding teaching. And she talks about how and it's unrealistic. And then you take into account other things like ESL students. That's just downright criminal that they're making them take these tests. So we live in a culture that is based on performance, and more so because we are surrounded by audit culture, for example, key performance targets, testing, key performance indicators. As Giles Deleuze in 1992 noted, we've moved from a society of discipline to a society of control. We only have to look at not only in education, but also in other work areas, whether it's education or it's any other so-called business. There is an aspect of market discourse, the discourse of management, the discourse of individuals as customers and consumers who have rights. For example, in the healthcare, as Lars Nordgren from Sweden in 2008, in his paper titled "The Performativity of the Service Management Discourse," has observed that the view of the care seeker has shifted from a waiting patient to a consumer, and now to a customer creating value. The medical meeting between a doctor and patient has now been termed as a service meeting, where the doctor is providing services to the customer, who's the patient. As far as education is concerned, we find present-day scholars like Bob Lingard, Stephen Ball, Raven Connell, Jane Kenway, they all note how teachers' work is being shaped by neoliberalism. And it's also therefore shaping the identity of teachers. They note how teachers' work is the passion that each teacher might bring to their work, but it's in stark contrast to the technical discourse that surrounds teaching. Teaching has become an instrumental discourse where technical efficiency has become important. Teachers are measured against standards, competency, or their work is perceived as being technically efficient or inefficient. So Stephen Ball defines performativity as a technology, a culture, and a mode of regulation, or a system of terror, in Lyotard's words, that employs judgments, comparisons, and displays as means of control, attrition, and change. Ball notes, therefore, that self-worth has become a slippery notion. It brings us to the understanding that we are now constituted of polyself, multiple selves. As Ficker noted in 1982, nowadays the struggle against the forms of subjection is becoming more and more important. Our understanding of ourselves, our personhood, is becoming more and more important because it's constituted of, as I mentioned, polyself. Even though the struggles against forms of domination and exploitation have not disappeared, it is this constant understanding of ourselves that has become important, because the market philosophy that we are surrounded by leads to enterprise building of the public school, of the health system, of academia. Public sector is being re-envisioned as businesses. Foucault, way back in 1970s, talked about how we moved into mercantile society. He says this in in his book called Discipline and Punish. And even Lyotard later on calls it the mercantilization of knowledge. So knowledge is not now situated in the big debates that around social cultural practices or the notion of social justice, but it's in the pragmatic, practical knowledges that each person can bring towards, ensuring profit or excellence in skills that is expected. Now, government institutes rules, policies, procedures, but it's also governing at a distance. I'll come to the concept of governmentality soon. So schools have lost their identity, and they lose their identity if they do not situate themselves in this kind of market discourse and the policies that are being instituted. These policies that are being instituted are also mechanisms that can change the personhood, subjectivity, and identity of the worker, whether they are nurse educators or teachers or government employees. It's about changing the individual, reforming them to become what the system wants them to become. That has become very significant. So we are expected to re-envision who we are, and the result, therefore, is the fractured polyself. This has led to teacher stress, as there are pressures of assessment, teaching targets. It's about adapting to the national curriculum. It's about how teachers or workers maintain their self-esteem. There is a false perception that surrounds teachers or employees because of this notion of performativity that has become integral to all work spheres. Stephen Ball talks about how there are two competing discourses. One is the policy standards led impersonal discourse, and on the other hand, there's the ethical subject of the teacher or the employee who wishes to be humane, personal, interactive, etc. It can't be, because Ball notes that it has all become focused on cost-effective outcomes, targets of productivity. Teachers are subject to regular appraisal. Even other workers are subject to regular appraisal, which has led to anxiety and emotional damage. And Ball notes how this trauma, there's emotional trauma, leads to greater trauma because we feel guilty, shame. There's an emotional intensification because of that accountability that's going on, which is then contrasted to the passion that a teacher brings to the classroom teaching. Ball notes, therefore, that there is a proliferation of gaming and fabrication because work needs to be effective rather than truthful. That's in the article that you've got, page 224. He notes that. So we are living in what is called the anxious society. We are living in the in what's called the anxious society. We just have to look at newspaper articles to note how teachers and principals are being faced with great trauma. One article notes how more than a third South Australian principals were violently attacked, and these are all quite recent articles. Or another article talks about the shocking toll on Aussie principals. Sydney Morning Herald reports the result of a survey where it is noted how in public schools, 40% of public schools have physical violence, sustained bullying, negative behaviors. 24% was found in Catholic schools, and 7% of independent schools also have physical violence and negative behaviors. As far as teachers are concerned, it is about how teachers are leaving the profession for more complex reasons than just pay. Other reasons have involved levels of professional support that was not given to them, a lingering lack of respect for the profession, casualization. So for teachers, it has been excessive workload, poor student behavior, lack of motivation to learn. Students and parents have blamed bad teaching. There's open disrespect. And a national survey found that teachers have As far as work is concerned, teachers reported the highest stress, nearly 46% reported stress because they felt overwhelmed. And there's aggression not only from pupils but also from parents. The classroom climate is now based on competition, both internal and external. They are faced with managing bullying and management strategies that are reactive. So it has come down to the self-worth being slippery. We are therefore, as Ball notes, living in a performative society. When Ball uh, um, used this term, he says that he used it because uh, in policy analysis, because it's not just a way of referring to systems of performance management, but to the work that the performance management does on the subjectivities and subsequently the identities of individuals. Therefore, Stephen Ball uses the term not only to refer to uh, to performance indicators, but to the complex and powerful relationships that result between these indicators. For example, NAPLAN as a performance indicator, and teacher professionalism and the identity that a teacher has. So, as Foucault noted way back in 1970s, we are subjects which have to be seen. So we are constantly visible. As far as the teacher is concerned, it's through the processes of inspection that's ongoing. It isn't an explicit form of an inspector coming to inspect schools, but it is in very subtle ways by which inspection happens. And it doesn't happen on one particular day. It's an ongoing process. Appraisal. It also consists of self-appraisal, quality assurance that we are expected to bring to work, the self-review that we are expected to undertake, research so that we can find new ways of operating in an excellent manner, and also constant assessment. And you can add your own. The list is endless. So as far as other work organizations are concerned, it is also constituted of the discourse of performativity. As far as employers are concerned, there is constant downsizing, outsourcing, as well as they've introduced flexibility in labor cost. This is the era of widespread mobility. There's a lot of fluidity in work systems. Those who like and adjust are benefited, others lose out because they cannot, and then they are penalized. In their book called The Wellness Syndrome, Carl Cederstrom and Andy Spicer discuss how happiness in present times is an emergent technique, which also emphasizes a moral aspect, but this moral aspect is based on defining right from wrong. So this kind of binary system has come in. What is right? It has to be adopted if you need to be happy. In a much more recent book in 2017, Pug notes how happiness now pervades life because it's associated with neoliberalism. The happy worker, as neoliberalism defines it, is the self-governed subject who's autonomous, self-determined, who chooses their worldview, looks after themselves in a competitive environment. Organizations have become networked, so autonomy, flexibility, commitment to corporate culture leads to corporate production, and this should make a person happy. Workers are given higher responsibility because they're expected to operate in that kind of market, competitive market. So we have happiness which revolves around workplace, a new work ethic, new ways of distributing power. Happiness has become the necessary psychological state that is needed to achieve material and social needs, not the moral aspect, which each individual might define in their own terms. Happiness has become a fundamental means to help people understand the processes of decentralization, competition, risk-taking, and control. So Pug notes how focus is on potentialities that have yet to be developed, on their abilities to create positive environment suitable to their needs. So it is this market entrepreneurial discourse that has come in, where each person is expected to be a risk taker, innovator, very creative, and entrepreneur if they're working within an organization. It is about creating the resilient individual who can achieve high job satisfaction through work performance, organizational commitment. They do not allow personal problems to beset them. And if personal problems do come up, then they are able to bounce back, turn setbacks into opportunities or for self-development. Judith Butler, in her book, Undoing Gender in 2004, talked about how we have become othered to ourselves. I am other to myself precisely at the place where I expect to be myself. As far as performativity is concerned, for many teachers, it impacts on their work to a great extent. It changes how they experience their work life, the satisfaction that results, and more importantly, how they perceive their ethical moral standpoint as far as students and parents are concerned. The EDN610 standards, for example, emphasizes the neoliberal agenda, and I'm not stating that it's wrong, but just that this is how it is reflecting the discourses of the 21st century to define the work of teachers and make explicit the elements of high quality, effective teaching in 21st century schools that will improve educational outcomes for students. The way neoliberal agenda manifests itself is through greater central control of what is taught, how it is taught, C2C, for example. The manner in which teachers' work is stipulated and specified through professional standards. Then, of course, we have performance management, where the person has to note, in terms of their professional work review, we have to note your shortcoming. And also, you've got to indicate how you're going to solve it. There are other audit mechanisms like high-stakes testing, NAPLAN, which makes the work very visible. So we have to be seen, as Foucault notes. There is, it is also compared with others. It brings us to the notion of concept of governmentality that was defined and explained by Foucault. It's a mentality, a form of mentality, forms of thought, as Michel Dean noted, that enables the state to exercise authority. As a broad term, it deals with a body of knowledge, practice, beliefs, viewpoints that impact on and determine how groups or communities operate. I'm explaining governmentality because we've got Nicholas Rose's chapter, where Rose talks about how technologies of power operate to show how there are institutions that shape and control behavior. Governmentality was a term that was coined by Foucault to explain how the state has control and governs the population. It is not something that happens as a direct form of control that happened earlier during sovereign rule, but it is a means through procedures, policies, regulations to govern the population. It also refers to how people govern themselves based on these policies and procedures. So it refers to how conduct is shaped and we conduct ourselves. It's a study of practices. It's about governing things, as Foucault notes. So Foucault defined governmentality as the ensemble formed by institutions, procedures, analysis and reflections, calculations and tactics that allow the exercise of this very specific, albeit very complex power that has the population as its target, political economy as its major form of knowledge, and apparatuses of security as its essential technical instrument. So in this definition of governmentality, political reasoning is associated. To govern is to understand and apply the notion of power in a rational manner. One governs by providing adequate arguments, justification by making a case. Through policies and procedures, the government is making a case. The second sense is in understanding how there is how self-control is promoted, how government defines the conduct of individual citizens, conduct which is governing, which includes self-governance and governing the conduct of others, which would imply that we understand policies and procedures and follow that in an appropriate manner. So governmentality operates on a continuum. On the one hand, you've got political rationality, and on the other, we've got this kind of government rationality produces policies and procedures, and it leads to self-managing conduct. In neoliberal times, it happens through both direct and indirect measures, what Stephen Ball calls performative discourses. So Stephen Ball also draws on Michel Foucault's notion of governmentality to talk about how performativity is a form of governmentality that operates both through policies and procedures and how we are expected to shape our conduct. There are three types of governance. There's self-government, morality, so we draw on beliefs, values, moral values and beliefs to operate in an ethical manner. There's the economy in terms of how family or institutions are governed, and that you've got politics ruling the state, which brings about the political rationality in terms of policies, procedures, etc. So the notion of governance then has become important. As Dean notes in 1995, our action of self on self is a constant folding in of the external influences. So for teachers, it is a folding in, enfolding of the authoritative voices of EITSO, of experts, of NAPLAN reports. The self is now constituted of various practices where each individual is an autonomous self, working on their conduct, behavior, and professional approach. Modern societies cannot be governed by totalizing forms of power, so we need techniques of individualization, which is what is happening. Then there are practices of government where through norms and procedures and policies, through a standardization process, such as teacher standards, there is a focus on the individual to monitor their work. The state commands, but is also willing to serve its subjects, which is why you've got policies, accountability, outcomes, reports. These are all expected by the state because it rules now through pastoral power. It looks after the community and the individual. So therefore, it requires to have knowledge of people, their physical details, mental thoughts, their personal secrets and details. Governmentality ensures the health, well-being, and security of the population. It provides salvation of individuals. The agents of this pastoral power, of course, are state apparatus, the police, medical institutions. So teachers are now seen as central to the reform process. Therefore, EITSO focuses on quality teaching or having aspiring principles. So governing the self happens through 4 technologies, as Foucault noted. These are the technologies of production, which permit us to produce, transform, or manipulate things. So testing is a way of producing, transforming our students. Technologies of sign systems that permit us to use signs, meanings, symbols, or signification. You only have to look at the statistics that's produced in NAPLAN reports, bar graphs, charts that help us then to understand how to operate in an effective manner. You've got technologies of power, which determine the conduct of individuals, principals, and their relationships with staff, the Department of Education, and how that has power to determine the conduct of staff, teachers, and submit them to certain ends or domination. And you've got technologies of the self that permit individuals to effect by their own means or with help of others a certain number of operations on their bodies and souls, thinking, conduct, and way of being. This is Foucault. Each needs a mode of training and modification of individuals. So as Foucault noted, there is the difference between taking care of yourself and knowing yourself. So here it is about taking care of the self that's become very important. In 1998, Bob Jessup brought about this term polycentric state, and later Kevin Morgan in 2007. They talk about how there are multiple ways of controlling. And Bob Jessup notes how there is a shift in the center of gravity around which policy cycles move. There is a new form of governance that is happening where all these technologies mentioned here have become simultaneously important. The nation state depends on state as well as non-state actors to realize its goal. It's not as though the state has given up control. It's a new form of power. It is one that is dependent on individual agency, a new form of social action. As mentioned before, teachers often leave the profession due to stress. A void then is created that is difficult for the organization to maintain. In order to cover that void, then there is higher accountability that is expected of other teachers. And as Ball notes, individuals are held accountable, responsible for action, which then leads to output, performance indicators. The policy agents are, they have a lot of control. Besides, of course, there's also privatization that is being pushed in very strongly, which is impacting on education directly or indirectly. As Nerida mentioned, the market model is now very important and constitutes the new morality of where every institution is being, or work organization is being pushed into this discourse of self-interest. We are faced with a dilemma. There is a shift in how we constitute our individual selves. From being focused on the classroom, now we are focused on outcomes, values that are deemed necessary to operate in an effective manner. Mode of subjection, that is the obligation to help others, is not based on professional judgment, but on the ethics of competition. Ethical practices is not based on a caring ethics. Nell Nodding's work on care ethics, as far as students and teachers are concerned, is no longer so important, but it's a fabrication that is designed to suit management requirements. Telos, that is the ultimate object or aim in teaching, is not on social justice so much as on ethics of excellence. That has led to, as Ball notes, fabrications. Fabrications, as Ball notes, are selections, representations that organizations produce that are informed by priorities and constraints set by policies. It does not matter if these are not truthful. The point is their effectiveness in the work market. These often represent a perverse form of resistance or response to performativity. So creating versions of the work or organizations that do not exist in real, these are produced versions, manufactured so as to be accountable. Whether true or otherwise, it is how effective these are. Acts of fabrication reflect back upon the practices they stand for. It is something to be sustained, so it does not matter if they're not truthful. Certain representations, therefore, are privileged, and these are often informed by priorities and constraints and the climate that's set by policy environment. Stephen Ball draws on Foucault to note how fabrications are versions of an organization. They are produced purposefully in order to be accountable. Does that mean that there is no Space for resistance and agency? Not at all. There is. Ball notes how we are confronted with a double-edged risk discourse. One is the peril of self-examination, where there's no relief from tension and uncertainty and unsettledness. And then we have the discourse that opens the risk of opening ourselves to ridicule and marginalization. So this double-edged risk is then, pushing us towards that notion of self-worth as slippery, where performativity gets etched on the soul. So on the one hand, we've got knowing ourselves, which is what is expected. On the other hand, we've got care of the self, the work of the politics of the self, where there's a continuous process of introspection. So resistance and agency could be possible if there's a continuous process of introspection, where there is also critique of the world outside. Foucault and Ball in 2015 talk about how we need that critique. And Foucault notes how critique is the movement through which the subject gives itself the right to question truth and to question power about its discourses of truth. And Foucault notes how critique will be the art of reflective indocility. It's a form of ethics, a set of techniques of living, a concrete practice of freedom. So both Foucault and Ball talk about how we need to critique. It's important because that leads us to introspection. Established patterns are to be challenged in order to ascertain what it is that is no longer indispensable. So care of the self, as Foucault notes, consists of work on one's body, mind, and soul in order to be able to relate to other people and live an ethically driven life. One means, as Foucault notes, is our philosophy of work, the kind of philosophy of work we bring. And as Ball in 2015 notes, it is fearless truth-telling. It may not lead anywhere, but at least it allows you to critique work. Notion of pastoral care has become important. And Michel Foucault also talks about the technique of self-writing, which allows us to reflect on our work and helps us to think about critique as important. More recently, Heidi Pizza talks about the importance of critical talk, and the first scenario shows how teachers do engage in critical talk. Pizza discusses how in urban schools in the US, teachers, through their critique of the practices that restrained them, offered an insight into how the system was trying to scapegoat them. But often, she notes how teachers do not follow through with this critique. They resort back to a deficit discourse around students and the system. So there is that process of reflecting, introspection, and our own philosophy of work that has become very significant if we have to understand our self-worth as not being slippery, as being flexible, but also having some kind of worth. Thank you for listening. Here are the references, and we are happy to talk more about it in our tutorials. Thank you.